So I've gone over the basics of echinoderm body structure with focusing on a particular group, which is the Asteroidea. So now all we're going to do is just a very brief look at some of the major classes of echinoderms, what characteristics they have generally, how do they feed, that sort of thing. Not a lot of detail for this particular course. In an animal biology course, we'd go into it in a lot more detail. So these are the five kind of major groups that we have the echinoderms broken into. One of the things that they're going to have in common is going to be the pentaradial symmetry and the water vascular system. And then they're going to have variations on how some of those things are organized, but those things will typically hold true for all the classes. So one of the most ancestral groups of the echinoderms are a group referred to as the crinoids. Crinoids are sometimes referred to as sea lilies, sometimes feather stars, in a way that they have arms, typically fives again, or multiples of five, with pinnules with these little like branching structures sticking off them that look sort of feather-like, and they're filter feeders. Some crinoids have these little hold-fast structures so they can grab on to a surface, a rock or a coral or some other organism, and just sit there while they can feed, and then they can capture food particles here and then move them down to the mouth, which will be in sort of a central region. So their organs are then in a little disc in the center with the mouth facing upward, as opposed to the sea stars, the asteroids, the brittle stars, and the echinoids whose mouth are going to be facing downward. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. Here the mouth is facing up. And that's kind of mostly what we're going to go and just talk about that a little bit. That this group has another version of them that is now extinct, which are the stalked crinoids, which is essentially the same overall likely body structure and arms and everything else, but they had this long stalk. And they're well preserved in the fossil record. And these little discs are almost like vertebrae, right, in the way that they interact, with one another. And those organisms were likely fixed in one place and couldn't move around, whereas these crinoids that we have today, that have the cirri, they can actually kind of crawl around and relocate and move from place to place. Although they're usually sitting in one spot, they can move around. So crinoids are a group of echinoderms. They are the most ancestral group related to these stalked crinoids, and today we do find them in a variety of places, especially on tropical reefs, and they're filter feeders. Then there's a group that we used as our model, the Asteroidea, or the asteroids. Those are the sea stars. We covered a lot of the basics of them with the general model, right? So they have the pentaradial symmetry, fives or multiples of fives in terms of arms. The little dot on the top here isn't the mouth. The mouth is on the ventral side. The bottom, we call it their aboral side. This would be the madrepori. It'd be opening to the water vascular system. So they have the water vascular system with the tube feet and little suckers at the end of them, and they can move around and adhere to surfaces with that. They're generally predators. In a variety of different marine ecosystems. Right? And again, remember from the last lecture, these are all marine, so keep that in mind again. No terrestrial echinoderms, no freshwater echinoderms. And then we have this group here, which is a little bit different. They look a little bit like the asteroids. People might think they're the same, but they have a number of differences. And this is a group called the Ophiuroidea. Often referred to as brittle stars. And sometimes serpent stars. And that's because of the arms. The arms are very different in this group. So in the asteroids, we have the organs in the arms. So if we looked at that overall body plan that we had in the last lecture, the gonads, the piloarctica extensions were all out into the arms, but we don't have that here. All the organs of this serpent star, of the ophiuroid, are all focused in a central disc. So everything is in the disc. The arms are for locomotion and moving, and they'll have branches of the water vascular system running through them, which in this case are mostly used for chemoreception. They're typically not used for adhesion, so they generally lack the little suction cups at the ends, the tips of the podia. So they don't use them to grab on. They use these arms, which are highly articulating, so their arms, the way in which all the little discs fit together, are very much like the stalk, of the crinoid in terms of structure, but used in obviously a very different way. This is to give them height as a filter feeder and keep them stationary in one place, whereas these structures are used to crawl around. They can actually move very fast. They could dig into sediment. They can crawl over the tops of things. They have a whole variety of different feeding strategies. So some of them are predators. Some of them are filter feeders. Many of them are detritivores, though. So they can kind of crawl up like a crinoid, up on the top of, say, a sponge, another organism, and hold these arms up like that and then capture little food particles. They can dig in the sediment, and they can find other organisms, small dead organisms, and eat them and pull them in. Some of them actually will hunt down and kill other organisms and consume them as well. There's one in Antarctica that I saw. It's a very large ophiuroid that moves very fast through the sediment and eats other animals. Then we have the echinoids. This group is also referred to as the sea, so this group here is what we're talking about. This is the sea urchins. So sea urchins are going to be unique in a number of different ways. One is that their ossicles are fused. So here we have ossicles forming these little disc-like structures that articulate along the arms. Here they have ossicles all within tissue of the body wall that can make them very rigid and give them support. Here we have ossicles, some of them inside the tissue, the softer tissue of the central disc, and also along the arms. Here what we have are the ossicles are fused into a solid globe-like mass, so almost a ball-like structure. There's a major opening at the bottom of that structure, which is where the mouth is. It's the only real soft spot on the animal. The rest of it is solid all the way around. The animals who eat sea urchins, some of them know this, and their strategy for eating a thing that has a whole bunch of sharp spines sticking off it is to flip them upside down, because that's the only vulnerable spot they have, is the area around their mouth. So, fused ossicles that make this test-like structure is what we call it. That's not a shell. It's not referred to as a shell. It's referred to as a test, but it's kind of like the shell, if you want to think of it that way. Here, associated with the mouth, they have something very interesting as well called an Aristotle's lantern. So this is sort of a tooth-like, so there's 5 plates, so again, pentaradial symmetry. So there are these plates, these diamond, or sort of triangular shaped plates that together, form a pyramid-like structure that's associated with a variety of muscles. Again, we don't have can't really be going into it in this class, but in this mouth area with their mouth hair in the middle of it, these structures are used for biting and rasping. Usually they're used more so for chewing on macroalgae. Urchins are almost exclusively herbivores, feeding on a variety of different types of seagrasses and algae. Some of them might graze off of the material living on the surface of those, but generally that they'll be eating those sorts of organisms for their food. They also possess then a whole large number of spines for protection. So these are sort of extensions of structures that would be somewhat like the ones in the asteroids, or the spiny skin that's sticking off them. However, these spines interact with the internal musculature, so the animal can actually move the spines. They're not just static and just sticking off it. They can move individual spines. They can detect light sensors, and so you can actually see a place where you can move around a sea urchin. It can detect the shadow, and sea urchins will actually then say point these spines at the area where the shadow is coming from and track it and move it around. The length of these spines can be very long or fairly short depending on the species. Some of them are laced with toxin as well. So there's a very interesting group. There's a lot to go into it. People do farm sea urchins because they consume the gonads, and they've been actually collected to extinction locally in a number of different areas because people eat them so frequently, and there's a big aquaculture industry of growing sea urchins and studying them and their development and their feeding and their larvae and metamorphosis and a whole variety of other sorts of things. So this is a pretty well studied group. They also have impact on a number of marine communities. There are some places where they have not been kept in check. So say sea otters who eat them have been eliminated in certain areas, so then the urchins go out of control. Then the urchins will eat the bases of a number of kelp, the holdfast, and then the kelp floats up to the surface and is gone, and the whole area becomes they call it a sea urchin barren, because that which was once a very interesting marine ecosystem, diverse with a variety of different organisms, fish, and all sorts of invertebrates living on and between the kelp, is just gone. It's like deforesting an area, and the urchins are doing this just because they're out of balance because their predator has been removed. So they have impact on a variety of different marine communities as well. They're an interesting group to look at in more detail another time. And then we have the holothurids. Which are the sea cucumbers. So they're called cucumbers because their body is generally very soft and somewhat worm-like. So they're elongated, kind of like the shape of a cucumber. Their anus is at one end and their mouth is at the other end. So again, it's a little more worm-like, again, than some of the other echinoderms are. They do have the tube feet in 5 rows, typically along a ventral surface of the animal, and they are typically filter feeders and deposit feeders. So I don't know if we brought that term up before. So filter feeder, there have been a number of organisms we've mentioned who are filter feeders. They have some type of tentacular structure, so highly branching tentacles that are used to capture food. One of the bigger differences between these is that this tentacle structure here is all water vascular system, so modifications of tube feet and tube feet-like structures. Whereas this, while they have water vascular system in it, all these branching tentacle structures are hard. They actually have skeletal units that actually build all of them. So this whole thing might be preserved in fossil record, whereas none of this would be preserved at all because they have highly reduced ossicles. So very limited ossification, so not much material left to fossilize the holothuroid. So they're far more rare in the fossil record. And again, I didn't mention I talked about filter feeding. Deposit feeding is where they feed on sediment. So essentially, they use the tentacles to adhere to and grab sediment, and then bring the sediment to their mouth, and they kind of eat and process that. So they have a couple different, a little more passive type of feeding strategies. They're typically not predators, except if you consider that some of the organisms that they're filtering out of the water might be larval animals, so then they'd be eating them. But there's a variety of materials that they can filter out of the water in most cases. Because their body is soft, they don't have the obvious protection that the others do, spines and really hard materials. So they tend to have a lot more distasteful chemicals. They can also do a strange behavior where they can, to escape a predator, eject all of their internal organs and then kind of crawl away. So the predator then might be left to eat the inner organs of the cucumber, while the body then moves away and then regenerates those organs. And so they can survive without it for a period of time by storing nutrients in their body tissues. But people don't know exactly how they do it. It's something that has been studied and continue to be looked at. So echinoderms are also important in that people study their development because they're deuterostomes like the chordates, and we are chordates, and so they are actually closely related to us. And there are a number of different cellular things that are looked at when people are studying this in a lab, and they might use echinoderms as a model. So sea urchins are also used as a model organism in a lot of developmental biology, especially looking at the cleavage patterns and gastrulation and those sorts of things have been very, very well studied in the echinoids as a model. And that's mostly all we're going to really cover with them. Again, there's a lot more that could be gone into, but this is the basics of the group. So crinoids, these filter-feeding sea lilies, asteroids, which are generally the predators, the sea stars, the brittle stars, and again, I mentioned why they're called brittle, because they really tend to drop these arms very easily. They will regrow them. So most all the echinoderms can regenerate very well, except the echinoids, not so much. We don't have really great evidence of them regenerating anything. If the test is broken or destroyed, the animal typically dies. They can build new spines if spines are broken off. But other than that, they don't really have the great regenerative ability that we usually see in the other groups. So these sometimes are scavengers or sometimes predators. Echinoids usually feeding on algae or herbivores, and these are filter feeders. So a variety of different strategies of feeding in the groups, and sort of a rearrangement of some of the systems to look very different, but always having those core characteristics of the pentaradial, so the symmetry of 5 in some form, and some form of the water vascular system.